Welcome to Muted in Medicine, the podcast where we break the silence on the untold stories and pressing issues within the healthcare professional. Join us as we dive deep into topics that often linger in the shadows of medical corridors and are not discussed in conferences, meetings, social gatherings, and in the hallways. They are often hiding. From navigating errors and facing litigation to the often overlooked realm of mental health among healthcare professionals. Through candid conversations and storytelling, we aim to amplify the voices and shed light on challenges that resonate across the medical landscape. So grab your stethoscope and a cup of coffee and tune in as we uncover the layers of complexity in the world of healthcare that are so muted, yet so profoundly impactful.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Muted in Medicine, the podcast where we break the silence on untold stories in healthcare. My name is Saba Fatima, and I'm your host for this podcast. I'm a pediatrician with a passion for helping healthcare professionals facing secondary trauma at work in healthcare, which often they're unprepared to face. In medicine, we're taught that honesty is everything until something goes wrong. When harm happens, silence often follows. Not because people don't care, because the system has taught us to be afraid of blame, of litigation, of saying the wrong thing when words already feel so fragile. For patients and families, that silence can deepen the hurt, and for clinicians, it can often become a second wound. The ache of wanting to do right, but not being told to speak or not being able to speak. Today's guest, Leilani Schweitzer, knows this space intimately. She's a patient safety advocate who helps healthcare systems respond to medical harm with compassion, honesty, and accountability. Her journey into this work began after the death of her 20-month-old son, Gabriel, from a series of medical errors at Stanford Children's Hospital. In the years that followed, Stanford invited Leilani to join their efforts to improve communication and healing after harm, where she spent more than a decade helping patients, families, and clinicians find a way forward through transparency and compassion. Through that work, and later through her organization, Comms Corps, she's continued to shape how medicine can move beyond fear towards honesty and understanding. Her story has been shared through TEDx, the New York Times, and Radiolab, touching countless people across healthcare. Leilani, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Saba. That's a very elegant and thorough introduction. I appreciate that very much.
I'm really excited that you have decided to come to this podcast. So thank you for being here. We ask everybody when we start, what's bringing you joy today?
Oh, gosh. Well, I just got engaged. I'm very joyful and excited about that.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I just launched my company, Comms Corps, so I'm gathering information from beta users right now. So that's been an immense amount of work. So I'm glad to move on to the next stage of that. And I'm in Seattle today, and it is a bright, sunny, beautiful day. And that always makes me joyful.
That's awesome. Yeah. The weather is kind of starting to crisp up a little bit, and I like that too. I don't know if you like fall or not.
I prefer spring, but and sunshine whenever I can get it. So especially up here.
Yeah. So most people know you from your TEDx talk and your work at Stanford, but a lot of our listeners may not know. So if you feel comfortable, as much as you feel comfortable, share a little bit about your story and what brought you into this work around communication after harm.
Yes, I'm happy to share. So like most people who find their way to patient advocacy, it's not something I ever thought that I would be doing.
Yeah.
I went to art school. I studied architecture, graphic design, and had no intention or interest of being part of healthcare, just not my frame of reference whatsoever. And 20 years ago, my son Gabriel died after a series of mistakes made at two separate hospitals. The first in Reno, where I live, where he was treated for 5 days and misdiagnosed. And then we transferred him down to Stanford Children's Hospital, where a whole different series of mistakes happened, and he died there. And the first hospital in Reno has yet to have a meaningful conversation with me at all, while the second hospital, Stanford, they investigated, they apologized, and they explained everything that happened. And then about 3 years later, they gave me the opportunity to come and work with them. Actually, that was 6 years after Gabriel died that I started working with them on their communication and resolution program, which was called Pearl. And this was 14, 15 years ago. So the idea of communicating after harm events was fairly new. Some institutions had been working on that, but Stanford really started to embrace this movement at that time. And so I had the opportunity to work there for 12 years. I was embedded in risk management and worked shoulder to shoulder with the attorneys and the claims managers. So I really learned both sides of this. So I know what it's like to have an event explained, and I also know what it's like to be completely ignored by a hospital after terrible things happen. I know what it's like to be the patient, and I know what it's like to be the people who need to interface with the patient, explain what happened, what are the legal components of that, what are the regulatory components. So I really had the opportunity to learn a lot in my work at Stanford, and the colleagues who I worked with were so generous and patient and eager to include me that it gave me just a really, really unique perspective on the opportunity that is there after tragedies if we choose to lean into it and try to stop a bad thing from getting worse, which is my few word explanation of the work that I did there was, let's keep a bad thing from getting worse.
And thinking about your own story, when it happened, as a parent, as a family member, what did you expect at that time, and did things go the way that you kind of wanted, or it took a while to get there?
So that's an really interesting question, because it's requiring me to go back before I had an understanding of how this process worked. So fortunately, pressing wood, I'm very healthy. I had no experience with the healthcare system. And Gabriel was diagnosed with hydrocephalus when he was 4 months old. A shunt was put in his brain, and it was all quite normal. So I didn't have a chronic disease. I didn't have until that first shunt failure happened, which ultimately killed him. I had no experience. So I was not a frequent flyer, as we sometimes refer to people who interface with the healthcare system at all, or a lot. So when he died, again, no idea what to expect. And I took him to the emergency department on Thursday, and he went to the morgue on Tuesday. So it was astonishingly fast and absolutely horrible. So I know I was in a state of shock, like any kind of information. I don't know if I heard it or I didn't hear it. Some things are very clear in my mind and others are not. So, but I will say that Stanford's response to me at that time did not seem exceptional. It seemed kind and appropriate. I just never thought, oh, maybe they're never going to tell me anything, because they were so immediately engaging with me. Gabriel's neurosurgeon was on the phone with me. The nursing staff was on the phone with me. They told me what to expect. This is going to happen next. It's going to take this amount of time. And they followed up with that. And so when the hospital in Reno ignored my calls, ignored my letters, completely dismissed me, that was really shocking to me, because I had an entirely different experience. And now I know that the Reno Hospital's response is typical and Stanford's was extraordinary. But I again, in that moment of time, and I find this still, in patients and families we're so profoundly lost that any guidance that can be provided to us is so welcomed and appreciated. But very few, or I shouldn't say very few, I think it's getting better. But few get that opportunity.
Yeah. And you said the response was kind and appropriate and not extraordinary. What does that look like to you? What is like an authentic apology? Like what is an authentic disclosure in your days that you have worked on this especially important task and about communication?
So to me, what matters most is that patients and families have the opportunity to understand what happened to them and to ask questions and to understand as fully as they need to. And to my mind, there is so much damage that happens when patients and families are left wondering about what happened. And so pardon me again, I recognize that there are consequences, there's financial, physical, ongoing care. I recognize all of those things are consequences of harm and absolutely need to be addressed. But I feel very passionately that what matters most is that people are able to understand what happened to their own bodies or to their loved ones. And so if we can lead with trying to find understanding, that is what makes things more authentic, I feel. So I think I maybe am not completely answering your question. I'm leaving things out. But I also think there's this idea that to have these conversations, we need to have every word perfect. We need to have every fact. Everything needs to be buttoned up. And I don't think that's the right approach. I think the approach is to connect as soon as we can with harmed patients and families and just explain what we know right now and tell them what we're going to do next. And people don't expect perfection, but they do expect connection and to know that there is a process to get answers. I just think somewhere there's I think it's on a joint commission. They created like a do's of don'ts of disclosure, and it's out there somewhere, and it was created, I don't know, I think it's like 15 years old or something. And one of the things on there is that it talks about people will forgive a mistake, they will not forget a lie. And I think that is I think it's absolutely true. And it's such a concise way of talking about one of the things that inhibits this work is this perception that if we tell the truth, we're going to be sued. And the research and my experiences just do not validate that at all. There's an immense amount of research that people sue because they don't get answers. And I've seen it happen over and over again. And unfortunately, I will be contacted very regularly by complete strangers asking me to help them get answers from the hospital because they have been dismissed and they don't want to sue, but they have no other option, or they feel they have no other option. So that's another long-winded response to your question. But going back to the merits of disclosure are understanding, and that's what I think we should try to move towards.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree with everything that you said. I do know, like, because I am a healthcare provider, just thinking from that perspective, which is probably inculcated in the system, a few of the things that, where disclosure doesn't get done or it's not done appropriately is, fear of litigation, fear of blame, fear of consequences. Because you've worked in healthcare now and it's not very merciful to the healthcare workers too, the healthcare system. And obviously we work in imperfect systems. So I can understand where that tension comes, why that, even though the right thing to do is what you're saying is the right thing to do, but just trying to understand where that tension comes from a little bit. It's good that you talked about the word suit. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? You said that it comes when people don't get answers is when it happens more, or how can healthcare providers, ease that discomfort that comes with disclosure?
Well, I when I think about this, I think that we can talk about this or we can ignore it. And ignoring hard things doesn't seem to make them go away. There's a lot of, and Saba, you probably know much better than I do, the research and the anecdotes about what happens to physicians or nurses or clinicians of any kind after they're involved in an error. I mean, it's devastating. I'm not going to say it's as devastating as it is for the patient and the family, but the consequences of these events touch everyone, not equally, but everyone is impacted. And until we recognize that, I don't think we're going to make a whole lot of progress and work to create an atmosphere where we recognize bad things happen all the time. We stop pretending that isn't true. And so we prepare for when they do happen to, again, stop it from getting worse. So we create cultures of safety. We create processes to engage with patients and families, and we educate everyone so that they know what that process is, so they're not caught flat-footed when the inevitable happens, that there is leadership that supports this approach, and they talk openly about it. All of these things need to happen to help physicians or clinicians move forward with these non-medical interventions that I feel to be profoundly healing. And that, again, goes back to explaining what happened and giving people the opportunity to ask questions about what happened.
How did you transition? How did you find in your heart, compassion for the healthcare worker, having been harmed yourself? I heard a little bit of your TED Talk, and you were talking about the nurse. You were talking about the nurse who may have been involved in the error, and you said, she was expected to go to work the next day and to live with that mistake, and that's absolutely true. It's devastating for the healthcare worker too, and not to the extent that it can be devastating for the family, because obviously they've lost their loved ones. So there's no comparison. But I'm curious, how did you find that compassion within you?
So your audience understands what happened is Gabriel was placed on the telemetry floor, and the alarms just kept going off over and over. And I was completely wiped out. He was so wiped out, and every little twitch that he made, the alarms went off. And so the nurse, she did what seemed very patient-centered, very compassionate. She turned off the sound of the alarms in his room. And so I thanked her. I so clearly remember thanking her and fell asleep. But what had actually happened is she had turned off the alarms everywhere. So in his room, on her pager, and at the nurse's station. So the manufacturer of the monitors didn't think anyone would ever go through so much effort to silence the alarms. And so she didn't know that she was silencing them all. So that's a pretty significant system problem, right? Like, I didn't know alarm fatigue was a thing. Now I know it is very much an issue and a challenge. The manufacturer didn't recognize the extent the nurse would go to. But what also was happening is the reason that he was alarming was that his shunt was failing and eventually his brain herniated. So all of those things were, what was happening with his shunt was not recognized. It was just seen as alarms going off constantly. She turned the machine off. So this is a huge perfect storm, right? Very familiar Swiss cheese effect that we've heard so many times. And it's so clear that she never had any intention for that to happen. Absolutely no intention. And I think maybe that's why I never was angry with her or upset with her, because there was no intention. And I do, despite being many years, I do carry a lot of anger for the hospital in Reno where he was initially diagnosed. And the reason, and as you can guess, I've thought about this a lot, is because while no one wanted any harm to come to my son, if you or I could go back in time, we would undo all of that, but we cannot. But how we respond to these events, that is a decision. That is a very deliberate, considered choice. And while no one made a choice to hurt him, there was choices of how to respond to me. And one decided to do nothing, and one very deliberately decided to explain, apologize, and make things better. And I think that, aside from being born to the family I was born to, probably has had the biggest impact on my life, aside from anything else, is those two responses to my son's death.
Yeah. And I don't know if I've said it. I'm so sorry that really it happened to you. I mean, it's heartbreaking and it shouldn't happen. And I think we agree on that. There is ambiguity sometimes, when there is no clear harm. Maybe that happened, but it was indeed an unfortunate outcome. In your years that you have worked in the healthcare system, and even the work that you're doing now, for me, it sounds like, in that case, also just explaining what happened would be helpful for the family. Because I've noticed sometimes, when there's no answers, still, it doesn't give closure to the family, even though there might be communication, and it ends up in lawsuits and litigation of that sense. So how could that be handled, you think?
So that you've keyed into one of the real challenges of this work, and therefore a real excuse for why it doesn't happen is, you are absolutely right. So often we don't understand what happened, or more often than not, there is a bad outcome, but nothing could have been prevented. And those are the most challenging discussions, where you have a patient or family who is suffering, but nothing could have been done about it, and that needs to be explained, and that is very difficult to do, but it is absolutely essential. And so that's where developing that relationship with a patient and family, setting expectations for them, following through on everything, understanding their perspective, their experiences, their questions, their needs. When you can do that and you can form that relationship, and then you need to explain to them standard of care was met and nothing else could have been done, they are far more likely to trust and understand you when you give them that news, that there's not going to be compensation or, whatever kind of damages assessment, that it just is a really bad thing that happened to them. That is where they're far more likely to trust you and to believe you. And I know trust is kind of this amorphous topic, and I think we're going to get to that. There's a professor at Harvard's Business School called Frances Frye, and she works with businesses, but she talks about something called the trust triangle. And I love this model because it absolutely applies to. It doesn't just apply to businesses trying to get their consumers to trust them or their customers. So it's being authentic, it's being logical, and it's being empathetic. And those three things are so effective and necessary when we are engaging with patients and families after harm. So do we care about them? Is what we're saying, does it make sense? Is it logical? And are we being true? Are we being ourselves? And those three things, I've just seen it. It's real. And so that means maybe saying to a patient or family, we may never fully understand what happened. Setting that expectation, because depending on the facts of the case, that might be true. But it's where we make promises that we can't keep, or we speculate, or we avoid the conversation at all. Forget it. You're not going to get anybody to trust you, no matter what that resulting conversation is going to be.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Is there any models? You talked about there was a model that you used at Pearl. I've heard about the Candor model. I don't know if you've heard about that you can talk to us about, which focus on early communication and learning from harm.
So there's there's a lot of organizations that are working on this. The Collaborative for Communication and Improvement that's out of the University of Washington. Just yesterday, I had my last board meeting after the honor and privilege of serving on that board for 8 years. They're doing a lot of work around that. They do a lot of research. They're working to implement, take action from that research. There is the Candor program. Now we have CMS's new patient safety structural measures, and your listeners are likely quite familiar with those. But there's 5 domains. Domain 4 is transparency and accountability. And that one sets an expectation that governing boards attest to having a CRP or Candor-like program to engage with patients and families after harm. So because of that not legislation, requirement, that's probably not even the word, there's more groups that are moving towards creating a model that will work. And I mean, I'm working on that myself, so we'll talk about that more. But I'm very happy to see any movement in that space, and I don't think that there is one model that is going to work everywhere. I have yet to see that happen, where we can impose a system on top of another system. It really needs to organically grow out of recognizing that communicating with patients and families is caring for them, and just letting that be the push forward.
And who do you think should be doing, according to these models, like who should be doing the communication? Is it the provider? Is it someone who's a patient healthcare advocate or hospital? Do you know? I'm just curious.
Oh, so I think about this a lot. So I kind of believe that we all need to lean into our superpowers, right? So after an event, it's appropriate and I think mandated by, I think it's by CMS, maybe the Joint Commission, that the provider explain what happened to the patient and family and document in that in the medical record. And what I see happening is that's done. The immediate questions are answered, and then everyone moves forward with the uncountable tasks they have remaining in their day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the patient and the family, they've said, no, we don't have any further questions. But then time goes on and they do have more questions. And so who goes back and has those conversations? And that's the gap that I see. And when we don't have a system or a process to continue to engage with patients and families and to answer their ongoing questions, we leave them in a place of needing to figure that out themselves. So either they will move on too, and they will carry that hurt of not understanding. They will they'll need to navigate the health system to try to figure that out themselves, or they'll call a lawyer and give their one-sided explanation of what happened to an attorney, and we know what comes after that, right? So I think it is important that there are people who are trained to have those ongoing conversations with patients and families. So I envision it as social workers, patient experience experts, risk managers. It's not really the physician or clinicians. It's not the best use of that person's skill and expertise. We need them to be doing other things. So let's train people who have those soft skills to understand the process so that they can talk to patients and families, help them understand the process, be deliberate and very conscientious about maintaining those conversations, documenting things in letters, being there as their single point of contact. And so that's kind of the model that I see, which frankly is what I did at Stanford. That was, I knew what was going on with each case. My colleagues knew what was going on with every patient and family because I was that liaison in between, and it was effective. We helped a lot of people, and I know we prevented a lot of litigation, which is never good for anybody.
Yeah. What resources? I mean, I think that's great. I think those models should be in every hospital system, because I think the biggest reason why this litigation and shame for everyone involved happens is I think a lot from the healthcare perspective. And, because I've gone through, if I had a bad patient outcome, I've gone through it myself. I've thought about it, how to, even though I've explained everything to the family, after, because I work on the unit, and if the patient went to the ICU, they passed away, or I never had that chance to communicate with the family. And for me, it felt like maybe the family in that perspective thought that, the doctors don't care. They just are going about their lives, when in fact we do, but there's really it's like after a patient leaves the hospital, if they've had a bad outcome or passed away, like there's no communication, like it's done. And you're supposed to pass on to your next thing, even though you think about them and it hurts you deeply, like I know from my own experience. And so I am very curious about everything that you're saying, because I feel like our hospitals don't have those communication systems in place, of just, talking to the family. And I'm just telling them maybe that how sorry we are, like how sorry we are. We may in the moment, but afterwards, is there a thing where I've thought about, even sending a card, and I felt like, does that sound like an apology? Like if something bad happened, and will they misread it? So what is the ethics, I think, of like a healthcare provider after you think they've had a bad outcome? Or you talked about patient liaison and advocate, but how should they be, communicating with the families? It was a long-winded question. I'm sorry.
No. There's a lot in there, and I like all of it.
Yeah.
So I'm not an expert in ethics, but
Yeah.
I will tell you what I have seen repeatedly. And I think it's unfortunate that the humanity of healthcare is being beaten out of us, right? So one of the reasons why the physician is not having ongoing conversations is because the insurance billing number for that patient no longer counts, right? So
Yeah.
we don't expect any ongoing, and how are you going to find that in your day, right? Like you're probably not, because it's already full. The systems aren't set up yet. You think about it. You care about it. And what do we want? I think as human beings, one of the things we most want is our experiences to be recognized by other human beings, right? Like so after Gabriel died, a neurosurgeon, he just sat and talked to me with tears just rolling down his cheeks. It was very clear to me that he was devastated by what happened. And that humanity, that connection helped me in ways I can't even articulate. But it made me feel less alone. It made me feel like my son mattered. And I've seen it happen so many times. So I'll share a story. So child came to the ED, complex, and things did not go well. Many, many, many things went wrong. And the child died. And it took a long time to fully review and understand what happened. And during those many, many months, it was my role to talk with the family. And sometimes they would return my calls. Sometimes they didn't. And I would wonder, should I have said that? What am I doing? Like I stepped into my role with zero training whatsoever. So I was always winging it and hoping for the best, which wasn't the best feeling. But we finally were able to sit down and have a meeting with this family. And the mom and dad walked through the room and they were like hunched like they were walking into a windstorm, right? Like we all know that posture of where we're trying to protect ourselves. But they still came in. And then the physician who was involved, she walked in the same, like they were walking through the same storm. And so we sat down and again, we go through the care and it is complicated and it takes a long time. And at the beginning of the meeting, the dad says to the physician, "You are the face of everything that went wrong." And she didn't try to defend herself. She didn't try to explain. She sat there with the tears just rolling down her cheeks. So we go through and we explain everything that happened outside of those four walls. So the parents were in there with their child, as they should be. They had no idea of what else was going on. And so through that conversation, I mean, this gives me chills even right now. I've told this story so many times. It's so powerful to me that they were able to explain all of this. And then the dad says to the physician, "We had no idea you were fighting so hard for her." And the three of them embraced. And that did not take all of that family's pain away. It could not. But it gave them the opportunity, one, to understand. Like the facts of maybe the most impactful night of their lives. And two, to see that it mattered, that the physician loved that child, cared about that child, was heartbroken and profoundly impacted by what had happened. And if we follow the old model, deny and defend, don't talk, go to your own corners, the damage that happens from that is really clear, right? So that family would continue to wonder, they would be angry, they would be resentful. And who knows how that plays out. And the physician would never have the opportunity to explain what happened. And she was ready to leave healthcare entirely and then became a significant advocate for these efforts. But that's the power of these conversations and understanding. And so that's why I say my goal is understanding.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I work with children too, so yeah, that made me kind of tear up a little bit, because we never want anything bad to happen to any child. That's not why we walk into work. What is your, families who are struggling with this, patients who are struggling with this? What are some resources for them? What would you tell them? How can they act in such situations?
So, unfortunately, I don't think there's a whole lot of resources for people, which is another really big gap. But I will have strangers contacting me. And what I always say is assume positive intent. Don't assume that anyone wanted bad things to happen, because I just have never seen that happen. I've heard podcasts, but I have never experienced it or seen it in my life. So assume positive intent. Ask very specific questions. Don't be angry if you can. I know that's difficult. Don't make allegations. Just ask very specific questions. And there are a lot of advocacy groups. There's groups that can help. I should know this better, but there are patient safety groups that are created and run by patients themselves. So Patient Safety US, Patients for Patient Safety US. Again, I just don't think there's enough resources, but to be persistent, to be kind, maybe then you start understanding what are the requirements in your state. Sometimes things can be reported, but it leaves the same way that these events kind of can leave clinicians flailing out there. Patients and families can be flailing out there too. And that flailing is not good for either group. And one at least possibly has the litigation option, though that's pretty rare, because unless there's a large price tag on the consequence of what may or may not have happened, you're probably not going to get an attorney to take your case. So that's just another reality, is it's not so easy to go the litigation route despite the facts in the case. So I just kindly ask questions and be persistent and ask who's responsible for investigating, what are the next steps, when will you hear more. I'm a fan of copying the CEO I also encourage anyone to keep a letter to one single page. That's kind of detail-oriented, but if you overwhelm the person who's opening that letter on the other side, that's not going to help you get anywhere. So I try to be really pragmatic about this advice.
Yeah, that's all good advice, I think. And I like what you said, assume good intent. That's an important thing. What message do you have, I think, we talked about patients for clinicians, and, what is the one thing you think they can do better, or maybe a message for hope or support for them that you have who are going through this?
So I want to recognize that I haven't made a mistake that has harmed someone. So it's really easy for me to get up here and talk about what you need to do, right? And how, the truth will set you free, and lean into the research and be reassured that talking to people is what helps. But I guess I just would think about, what would you want if it was you? And to go back to that and maybe think of a time where you were in a place that was scary and things were uncertain, and what did you need? Maybe you got a phone call in the middle of the night with bad news, and what do you need to know? And to let that guide your conversations, because I have just seen, so I gave you one story of kind of reconciliation and understanding, but that's only one. I've seen it happen many, many times. And again, I mean, it's hard. This is hard for me to say, because I don't like telling people what to do when I have never been in that position. But I don't think that not acknowledging what happened ever helps anyone. I just don't think it happens. And if you're in a position of leadership, to recognize this is just a reality of healthcare, and what can we do after these events happen? How can we learn? How can we keep it from getting worse? That's part of your job. You need to support your staff and your colleagues by encouraging that and recognizing how difficult it is. And there's a lot of work around peer support programs and care for the caregiver. I don't love that term, or second victims. I don't love that term either, but I love the intention of it, of recognizing again, that the impact is not equal, it is shared.
Yeah. What keeps you grounded in your work that you're doing? And tell me more about what you're doing now in terms of your work.
So I mentioned that I went to art school, so that's what I wanted to grow up to be. So I still do a lot of art. I like to build things. I don't like to maintain things. So that's one of the reasons why I left Stanford, is that our process was created, and I liked the collaboration of building something, and maintaining it got a little bit less exciting for me. So I have created with my good friend who's a malpractice defense attorney, Kyle Sweet, we've created a company to train people who work in healthcare to have these conversations with patients and families. So it's basically taking everything that I learned in Stanford, being in the weeds, and the regulatory requirements and all of the research, and putting it into a 4-hour or 4 segments of 1-hour course that's all online. It's all asynchronous. It's inexpensive. We have CMEs for the people who want and need CMEs. And I really hope that this moves the needle on this. People have been working on this for more than 20 years. To Err is Human came out, 25 years ago, 26 years ago, and we haven't moved the dial very much. And so I'm not expecting that this is going to save the world, but I do want this to be accessible and immediately applicable to people. That's my goal. And our tagline for our company is communication is care. And I really believe that. I really believe that we need and have an obligation to explain what happened to people, and that is how we care for them. So that's what I've been cooking on. I'm excited about it. Steep learning curve to understand all of that. I expect that I'm going to learn a lot from the users and hopefully make it better, but that's what I'm pretty excited about these days.
If you would give a small snapshot to our audience, maybe. I'm just curious, and I always like to ask for exact verbiage too sometimes, because it's still, when you're doing it in the moment, you don't know what to say. But from a healthcare provider's perspective, like, or I'll say from a family member's perspective, what would an authentic apology, like, what words would you want to say, or what words would you not want to say? Do you have anything in mind?
Well, there's a lot of fear around I'm sorry, but that's what we want to hear. We want to hear that someone is sorry. We want accountability, and we want improvements. So that's an authentic apology, right? Is recognizing what happened, taking accountability, and trying to make it better. So we want to hear that. We want an explanation of the facts of what's happened, even if we only know a little bit right now. We want to know what we know right now and what is the process to understand more. So I know there's what they call sorry laws that protect that statement. I'm not a lawyer, can't claim full knowledge of this, but I'm not sure that there's ever been payout on a case where a patient or a physician has said, I'm sorry. I could be wrong about that, but I think that is such a false thing to be worried about, that when people don't get that, that's when they look for litigation. People really want to understand what happened, and they want their suffering to be acknowledged, and they want to make sure that nobody else experiences that again. And that, again, there's so much research that backs that those are the three things that people want, but we're not giving it to them. So hopefully that can be guidance for people who are in these situations.
Oh. Thinking about your own story, did you ever think about litigation?
So at that time, Gabriel died in California, but was misdiagnosed in Nevada, where the statute of limitations is only a year, and that is not a lot of time. I would have had to sue the physicians who basically saved him and gave him to me. So that would have been his neurosurgeon who saved his life, and his pediatrician who made me hopeful when I had a very terrifying diagnosis for my son before he was born. So then I would have needed to sue both of those people. And there was no way I was ever going to do that. If I could have sued the CEO of the Reno hospital and that system, yes, I would have done that. Or I would have thought about it, but that the process doesn't work that way, right? But if I think of who caused me a profound amount of pain, it's those deliberate decisions that hospital in Reno made. Those were choices. Where the other things that went wrong, there was never any intention there. No one wanted that to happen. So that's yet another long-winded answer, but I was informed, I understood what the process was going to be, and I don't want to do that. So I could have sued the people who I eventually ended up working with and becoming very close to, having an opportunity to kind of shift the culture. But if I would have sued, I probably would have spent 5 or 6 years. And for what? For what?
Yeah. Is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you would like to share before we go towards the end? This was a very profound conversation for me. I think it's just to sit down and have this conversation without feeling scared, and just have a transparent conversation where we're learning both sides of the story. I think that's what we need more of too. So thank you. Yeah.
I think that there's a perception. So whenever I'm on an airplane, and you sit next to your seatmate and, oh, well, what do you do? What do you do? And I'll say, well, I talk to people after they've had things go poorly in their healthcare. I get one of 3 response. One is like, put their earbuds in and let's not talk about it, because who wants to talk about things going bad when you're 30,000 feet in the air? Or they start telling me their own story about things going wrong. I would say that's the majority of the time because there's such a common problem. Or they'll say, wow, you must deal with a lot of angry people. And that's not true. I do not deal with a lot of angry people. And I think we have this perception that people are going to be angry and then we're defensive. And when we're defensive, that's what makes people mad, right? So if we can recognize, and I've seen it over and over again, people are afraid, they're vulnerable, and they don't know what's going to happen next. And they're overwhelmed. They're not angry. We can make them angry. And I've seen that happen too. But to recognize that people do not start out being angry after this event, after bad things happen. And to do what we can to move them from being angry. And that's to recognize where they are, to acknowledge what happened, to take responsibility, and to do our best to keep it from happening again. That's how we keep people from being angry.
Yeah, that's. I think that's very important, and thank you for saying that. I think, like I said before, it was very, very impactful for me just to listen to your perspective. And when I found you online, I thought, what great work you're doing. I think it's so important, and using your pain into purpose. I think I bet it's hard, but thank you for doing that. I would say. We have a tradition on this podcast that we end it with a poem. So if you will stay with me for that, it's about trust. So when something goes wrong in medicine, trust can feel like the first thing to vanish, but the trust isn't lost forever. It's rebuilt one honest act at a time. And your story reminds us, I think healing begins, like you said, not with perfection, but with presence and just listening. So the poem is called Trust by Thomas R. Smith. It's like so many other things in life to which you must say no or yes. So you take your car to the new mechanic. Sometimes the best thing to do is trust. The package left with the disreputable-looking clerk. The check gulped by the night deposit. The envelope passed by dozens of strangers. All show up at their intended destinations. The theft that could have happened doesn't. Wind finally gets where it was going through the snowy trees, and the river, even when frozen, arrives at the right place. And sometimes you sense how faithfully your life is delivered, even though you can't read the address. Thank you so much, Leilani, for doing this with us today.
Oh, I love that, Saba. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.